Without further ado, I would like to introduce today's first panel. So as a sort of conversation, we'll be having our experts discuss the role that commissions or ad hoc councils have played in order to make the pension reform proposals viable in the LAC region. And we'll also hear about the work done by the Uruguayan Social Security Experts Commission. This first panel will deal with the regional experience of pension reform councils and commissions. So it's my pleasure to introduce our two experts, Diego Valero, the CEO of Novastra and B-Way, and Rodolfo Saldain, the General Coordinator of the Uruguayan Pension Reform. And I will read the bios of our speakers. Diego Valero is a professor at the University of Barcelona and at the London School of Economics, dealing with specialized programs in pensions and behavioral economics. He also teaches behavioral finance at IE University. He holds a PhD in economics and actuarial science and a diploma in senior management from IESE Business School. He's also honorary president of the 2008 graduating class of the ICADE MBA and executive MBA. He's also professor of economics at Montessori International School. In addition to his teaching career, he has an extensive background in the business world. He's co-founder and president of Novastra and B-Way. He was president of OCOPEN, the Organization of Pension Consultants of Spain, and vice president of SpainSev, the Spanish Forum for Socially Responsible Investment. He has been chairman of the Scientific Committee of Life Colloquium 2017. He's academic advisor of the IPE Scholarship Fund. He has been repeatedly invited by the Parliamentary Commission of the Toledo Pact in Spain and other pension commissions in Latin America as well. He's authored several books and more than 100 articles. He has translated Peter Diamond's book, Peter Diamond being the Nobel Prize in Economics 2010, and also co-authored with Nicholas Barr, The Future of Pensions. In 2018, he published with Drs. Guillen and Ayuso the document on efficient management of saving after retirement, and awarded with the Premio Edad en Vida y Ventos. Rodolfo Saldain is a lawyer and former president of the Banco de Previsión Social, BPS, co-author of the pension reforms of Uruguay in 1995 and Costa Rica in 1997. He has been a university lecturer and has published dozens of articles in specialized journals, as well as chapters in collective works on labor and social security issues. He is the author of Reforma Jubilatoria, el nuevo modelo previsional, 1995, and co-author of Beneficios Laborales en Seguridad Social, la Reforma Tributaria, dating back to 2007, both works published by the University Culture Foundation. His latest book, La Era de los Nuevos Viejos, Longevity, Work and Retirement in the 21st Century, was published in 2020. He was chair of the Commission of Experts on Social Security, to which the government of Uruguay commissioned a diagnosis and recommendations for reform, and he's currently general coordinator of the Uruguayan pension reform. Rodolfo and Diego, a warm welcome to you. Are you ready? Yes, sure. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. So as we have seen these days, pension systems continue to face major challenges. For example, low informal sector worker participation, the difficulties that older persons experience, in addition to other factors. But there's also demographic changes, social and fiscal tensions, which are issues that are hard to grapple with, and it's not easy to adapt to them in time due to institutional weakness. So, Diego, in your experience in Latin America, how does this lack of institutionality impact the ability to conduct the necessary and timely reforms with regard to the fundamentals of pension systems? Right. Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon from Madrid, which is where I currently am. Thank you very much, IDB and IOS, for the very kind invitation to share some time with you. I'm really pleased to share this panel with Rodolfo. He was kind and even courageous enough to invite me to be part of the group that was with the commission he has chaired. And by the way, I would like to congratulate him on the results of the report, which I think is excellent. Let's hope that can be carried out, and let's hope Uruguay can have the system it deserves, which should be the case with all countries, of course. And going back to your point, Laura, I fully agree with you that low institutionality is an enormous problem. We see this in very many respects. At the end of the day, it all leads to the same point: low institutionality, fraud, tax evasion, avoidance, but it all basically converges on labor informality, which is extremely high in the region, with people entering and exiting the formal labor market, which means that pension systems face difficulties in order to deliver the originally planned pensions. And I would like to note that this happens both in pay-as-you-go as well as savings-based systems. In both cases, informality is a scourge, first for the workers themselves, who are left unprotected without a future pension and without being able to exercise the rights. That to begin with. But this is something we find in all systems. I would say there are two crucial challenges that afflict all pension systems, and they have to do with the very foundations of the systems. Actually, longevity, the growing demographics, which I will touch upon in a while, and then, of course, the profitability factor in systems. And by this, I mean, when we talk about the profitability, it would seem as if we were focusing only on savings-based systems with individual or capitalization accounts. But profit margins is also an issue in pay-as-you-go. Of course, if you have reserve funds, this has an impact, but at any rate, profit is a measure of system balance. In fact, in pay-as-you-go systems, there's a way to holistically look at balance and sustainability over time of pay-as-you-go systems, as part of which profit margins are the key variable. The internal profit rate measured as the differential between the current value of contributions or payments and the present value of benefits, which determines the internal rate of return of the system. According to an old formula of good old Professor Samuelson that still holds true, if the internal rate of return exceeds the long-term growth of GDP, pay-as-you-go systems exhibit serious sustainability challenges. So profit margins also affect pay-as-you-go systems. Demographics will obviously have an impact because we are living around the world a period of unprecedented demographic growth. In the last century, life expectancy has doubled, and it will continue to rise. For 200,000 years, life expectancy hardly changed, all the way from the Neolithic to late 19th century. Life expectancy hardly changed, and in the last century, it has doubled. We are growing at some 4 years for every 10. The pace is picking up, and some specialists talk about escape velocity. If we're going to reach longevity, escape velocity, for every year that goes by, we'll live over a year more. And I mean, this might turn death into a merely technical issue. Of course, that's a different kettle of fish. Now, what do we see in the region as far as pension systems are concerned? We talk about informality, we talk about demographics, and as part of this first intervention, I would also like to make an additional comment on so-called unkept promises, especially in savings-based systems. These unkept promises are promises that were impossible to keep, so that's why they were never kept. With middle range contribution systems, it's impossible to achieve replacement rates of 40%, even in the best of cases. So all systems that started off with the idea of having replacement rates at OECD country levels, which may be over 60%, that was not viable with the contributions. The recent Mexican reform has taken note of this and has raised the level of contributions. However, let us be aware that the solution is not to increase contributions, because in countries with weak institutionality, an increase in contributions is bound to lead to more fraud and informality. So we need to focus all on addressing these challenges globally, which means that we need to offer coverage to all those in the informal sector. We need to find a solution for all of them. We need to supplement the pensions of those in the formal sector because the pensions are low, and we need to revise the contributions in a smart and progressive way so as not to incentivize informality. And we need to revise the retirement age so that it is gradually but automatically geared to the increased life expectancy I was talking about. As part of all this, and I will stop with that, in my view, the lessons emerging from behavioral economics can help us do things much better and achieve more appropriate results in all reform processes. Interesting points, Diego. Thank you very much for that. And I would now like to ask a question of Rodolfo. In Latin America and the Caribbean, Rodolfo, some countries have already made efforts to strengthen their institutionality in order to deal with the different sorts of impacts, all these impacts that Diego was talking about. Can you tell us a bit about the experience in Uruguay? Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It is indeed a pleasure to share this panel with Diego, whom we've already had a chance to work with and have his contributions at the Commission. I would like to take this opportunity to share some slides, which I think can be of some help. I hope you can see it. Yep. Back to something that Diego was saying, so as to provide some context regarding the experience in Uruguay. In Uruguay, the situation might be interesting vis-a-vis Latin America due to some factors related to the labor market, which is pretty formal. The informality is around 20%, which obviously makes it easier for the country to achieve considerable coverage levels. What's more, after the pandemic, during the pandemic, we thought that economic recovery would have a greater impact on the informal sector, but recovery has been mainly led by the formal sector, and informality has actually fallen even more. We don't yet know if this will just be a temporary development or if some longer term trends can already be recognized. This means that in terms of social security, coverage in Uruguay is very high, almost 80%, a little over 80% of active workers have social security coverage. And even during the pandemic, this proved very important, as it meant that unemployment insurance, which is strong in Uruguay, helped greatly. And the same thing with health and insurance against sickness, especially in the context of the pandemic with all of its consequences. As regards pensioners and the elderly, coverage is also very high. Almost 9 out of 10 65-year-old Uruguayans, 65 plus, have social security coverage. And this, as we'll see on the graph, is something that has been the case for a very long time. In fact, we have seen this quite constantly in the last 20 years, and that is a very significant strength. Now, this means very high contribution rates. Uruguay has an average 22.5%, a pension contribution rate. So contributions to the pension system. So this is far from the situation in other countries where it's around 10% in the region, the case of Chile and Mexico and so on. So it is not cheap. Social protection is not low cost. It requires a significant effort as well as very strong fiscal support. In addition to these resources from contributions, there's a very important contribution in terms of fiscal resources to Social Security, which means that Uruguay, and this is a graph I very much like to explain the situation, on the vertical line, we have the level of public expenditure on pensions with a reference to GDP. It's not the latest information, but it includes a lot of countries. And on the horizontal axis, we see the demographic dependence relationship, older people as opposed to people in working age. And there you can see the expenditure levels by the state, by government on pensions. It's similar to Germany with considerably lower aging levels than in mainland Europe and with rising expenditure trajectory, which has led to this for quite some time. In Uruguay, there has been talk about the need for system reform, for a pension system reform. And here you will see statements by three presidents in the 15-year period during which the broad front was in government. Former President Vasquez, on a trip to Mexico, talked about the need to deal with this in order to prevent what was then referred to as the system bankruptcy. Former President Mujica also talked about the need to raise the pension age, the retirement age, and the former leader of the economy ministry, the economy minister, talked along similar lines. So what is the foundation of all this? Demographics. Uruguay is on the way not just to see rising life expectancy levels, but its population will also be shrinking. This mainly as a result of lower fertility rates. We are at 1.4 children per woman. Demography experts talk about 1.1 as a balance rate. And as time goes by, fortunately, our life expectancy grows.
For every additional year, 60 years of age, the life expectancy will increase 1.5 years for each year. So it's an important impact. When the present government takes office, President Lacalle takes the law for the government program of the multicolor coalition, and it reflects the need to deepen the reform of Social Security, and it creates a commission of experts, which is the one that I presided. We're talking about Uruguay, and I would like to enter into details on the functioning of the commission, the membership, etc. Yes, but let me finish with the political issue. This is divided in two halves politically. The results of voting in 2019 is the one you see on the screen. The government coalition, 50.7%, the Frente Amplio, 49.21%. And then there was a referendum in Uruguay. Uruguay is very much in favor of referendum and plebiscites, and the government and the opposition coalitions had the same percentages broadly. So we have a division in two main groups, two main uh, uh, groups of the population. Uh, Regarding what you were asking, I think it's very important to be able to give you an idea of the functioning or the mandate of the commission. The mandate was double. First of all, it had to diagnose the system, and this was reflected in a report, which we will discuss further on. I am showing on the screen the main points of the legal mandate. This is on screen. And we had to analyze the strengths and weaknesses of the pension system and the impacts of the demographic circumstances, the processes in the labor market, which are very important. The future of work has been impacted by the pandemic. But when it comes to recommendations, the committee had to examine the relevant international experiences. The IDB helped us a lot. We were able to see the Swedish experience in its different pillars. We entered into the details of Canada. And in that regard, we invited Diego to take part, as well as Jose Antonio Arce, who will be with us further on. And the legal mandate said we needed to submit recommendations for to give a reasonable security of income through a combination of tools, contributory and not contributory pensions. And we had designed a system with 4 pillars, a very important pillar, which is separate from the labor market. And this was what we were seeing as trends in this issue. Of course, there are generational biases that could be very important. The levels of poverty have an incidence of 2% in the system. And there we have a very...
Y tenemos un mandato expreso que le dio la ley a la comisión, es el diálogo y sobre todo recabar la opinión.
Dialogue. And we had to bring in the opinion of the different parties which make up the system. The membership of the committee was the one you see on the screen, 15 members, which were named in consultation with all political parties, with the trade unions. There's a group of trade unions, and they nominated one of the members of the committee, consulting with the chambers of commerce, the unions, and the groups of retirees. And we tried to reflect in this committee the political spectrum of the country and all other interested parties. It was a technical profile, the one that we were looking for the members of the commission. And the main guidelines for our work were basically transparency. That was the most important. All work of the committee should be made public. It should be of public knowledge. And the main tool here was the webpage of the committee, which had hundreds of thousands of visits and a very strong institutional presence in the networks. So it would use the best of the internet. The other guideline had to do with working on the basis of evidence. And the technical secretariat had available some 20 professionals in different sectors, sociologists among them. We had 30 national and international consultation uh, sessions. And then the third guideline had to do with dialogue. Dialogue had to be very important in this process, as well as communication. Communication linked to the issue that we were trying to solve. Mass media was used a great deal, and this increased the knowledge of the population in the field of pensions. So these were the four main guidelines for our work. We tried to focus on our activities on those four pillars. It's interesting what you say, Rodolfo, because yesterday we were discussing the importance of these different facets. Evidence, dialogue, and particularly communication. We had a panel uh, which focused on communication in the framework of the reforms. And I would like to ask Diego the following. Rodolfo told us about the main traits of the Uruguayan Commission, the political sectors that took part. And Diego, have you identified common traits in the design of these pension committees in the region? Well, first of all, I would like to say that the first committee is not in the region, but in general terms, the main reform commissions that have been created in the world. For example, in Sweden, for the study of the pension system, the British committee, the committee that developed the radical change of the British pension system, it was very important to realize that at the beginning, the Toledo Pact in Spain was very instrumental in this regard, and as well as the committee in Chile and in Uruguay. But to some extent, I think the role of the committees has been diluting quite a bit. And I don't see main traits that can be that they would have in common. I would like to tell you further on what, in my opinion, are the main traits that these committees should have. I share 100% of the comments of Rodolfo with certain caveats. But Chile, as you know, had two experts committees with international experts, representatives of key sectors. And the first of the Chilean commissions, the Marcel Commission of 2006, was successful for several reasons. I will delve on this further on, but there are some common traits for the success of the committees. The first is its chair, the person who directs the committee. Second, a commitment of the government vis-a-vis the committee, because this has to do with issues that can be considered critical for society, and the government in charge is has that as part of its political platform. And there also needs to be a very strong support by the ministries in control of the purse. I think in the first committee of Chile, the support of Andres Velasco, the finance minister, was fundamental for the functioning of the commission. Uh, but however, the second Chilean commission, in which some of the main experts of the world in this type of investment were represented, it did not make progress. It was stuck in something that could have been a very important development. There were several elements, as you might remember. They were voted by the experts whether or not the saving system should be kept as such or should be changed. The voting was very close, and it and maybe they didn't have enough support from the legislative branch or the public opinion. In Mexico, the development of the commission's work has been different, has been very Mexican in style, with meetings in which the government, the entrepreneurs, and the trade unions have been present. And it was kicked off by President Lopez Obrador together with the trade unions. And we saw the agreement that was finally reached. Of course, this was after many intensive debates, no doubt. Panama has a commission to review the Social Security Fund only. This is a very important part of the system, but it's only one part of the system that we have the presence of experts, trade unions, and the government. But as far as I know, they have not made too much headway. But the DR reduced a committee of the two chambers with public hearings. The government has sent the pension debate to the Economic and Social Council because after 20 years in that country and other countries that have had the system for 30 years, such as Peru and Colombia, and they are now seeing the need to review the system. In Peru, for example, there is a committee in Congress and in the House of Representatives. I had the honor to be called to participate in this committee, but there hasn't been too much progress. And this is due to the fact that the legislative priority has been very negative. I think we all can agree on that. The issue of focusing the pension issue on early withdrawals, as we have seen in Chile and Peru. And when you focus on that, it's not useful to talk about pensions. You have to understand that the pension systems should be geared towards the payment of retirement pensions and not for anything else. So if you do not start with that premise, nothing can be done. As far as I know, in El Salvador and Colombia, there has not been that type of committee. The one in Uruguay has been described by Rodolfo, and I think it's a good example of how this should work. There should be a good diagnostic report and good recommendations. Of course, this should go through legislation or be translated into registration, and that's the current challenge that Rodolfo has. But I think that some of the main traits, particularly the traits of the committees to be successful, are also the fact that the experts should be very knowledgeable and they should be able to work without any type of disturbance. And I think transparency is important, but we also should leave space for debate. In my opinion, not everything should be made public, but at least in my experience in other countries, among them my country, the retransmission on the TV, the direct passing on television of the sessions where we explain things, give rise to another space for parliamentary debates instead of making further progress. So yes to transparency, but with a space that gives room for a calm debate, because these issues are very complex. They're very complex to understand for the population in general. It's very easy to be a populist, and these committees do not have to be places to get votes. You have to be able to discuss calmly with the support of the government and the legislative branch and report to the population in a way that is understandable. And I think that is critical. There are other issues that are important. For example, the age of retirement. Rodolfo was explaining the case of Uruguay. I also made comments on this. We're talking about a growing longevity of the population, and it's evident that no government likes to increase retirement ages. This is very difficult politically, and the government can lose an election due to the retirement age. It has to be an issue up for consensus, because I think we are all in agreement, but it could be a matter for political speculation. There are other countries, such as European countries, that have begun to apply something that I think is very interesting to avoid this situation. That is to say, to legislate once and for all that the retirement age will be adapted gradually to the increase in pensions. So you don't have to change the age of retirement occasionally, which is very costly, but we have a procedure that is automatic where we can regulate the entire set of causal relations between the increase of life expectancy. It can be done by groups, and it can be, and you can also do something that's very important. The increase of life expectancy is not homogeneous. It increases more in proportion for people with high levels of income vis-a-vis low levels of income. So this has to be taken into account. Nothing is neutral, so you have to take into account all these variables. Well, yes, Diego, I think you're right. And I think we went through the entire region. You referred to the process in several countries, and it was a very interesting remark. And now I would like to go into another important issue that has been discussed by both, and it has to do with political dialogue. What makes reforms in social security so difficult? Because this takes us to the importance of political dialogue. In several countries, the discussion of this type of reform is very complex. There are several political forces in opposition. You have the trade unions, the pressure to obtain resources in the short term. And it's not only obtaining the best political proposal for the system, but it also should be financially and politically sustainable. In that regard, Diego, how do you see this process of political dialogue in the region? And also, I will give the floor to Rodolfo to explain how the political dialogue has been carried out in Uruguay. Diego, in the region, I think what is happening in the entire world. It's based on the short term and in political advantages. This is very unfortunate. There is a very short future vision. Sometimes you look for scapegoats. Solutions are offered which are populist and short-term solutions. There's no analysis of the impacts, and the needs and wishes of the population are not taken into account. I think that it is very important to uh, understand the customer, as marketing experts would say. The customers are the citizens. We have to understand what their situations, their wishes, their needs are, and we have to understand that it's very difficult for them to understand the social security systems. So we need to give them solutions that are valid for the entire population without a great effort, and give them the option to elect other alternatives. Some countries have been developing what we call nudge offices, behavioral psychology offices, which are useful for many things, but particularly to give the process of a people centered vision, a vision centered on the citizenry of the country to. Uh, to reflect their needs and wishes because the social security system is has to be geared towards the protection of the citizens. Where we, when we talk about retirement, we're talking about protecting people in their old age. Since old age is not the same for all people, and social and economic circumstances are different, we now have a fourth industrial revolution that will give us a form of working in society that will be completely different. Nowadays, in a computer like the one we are looking at right now, we have a processing capacity equivalent to a human brain. In 20 years, the capability to process will be equivalent to all the brains in the world. So the world will change in a radical way. We are seeing this in the labor markets are present. They will change in a very deep way. We will have to work less hours. Work will be of higher quality. The Industrial Revolution, and this we can see with the internet and all the solutions provided by internet, it does not eliminate jobs. It creates more jobs than those it eliminates. However, we could have the pause of Engels. It will not affect the generation directly. So we need to protect that generation. But in the long term, we clearly are headed towards a world in which we will work less and we will be more productive. But we need to understand all of this in the context in which we are right now. And social security in the world are this jacket we are wearing, and we need to adjust it permanently. When we talk about reforms, we have to think that reforms will be permanent. We could have a more or less solid model, and that's what we want to reach. But then we have to adjust it occasionally as needed. In this issue, I have been observing in many debates that the debates are not very solid from a technical perspective because they are geared towards a population that is not knowledgeable on this issue. If I am a citizen of any country and there's a candidate for president that tells me, don't worry, I will guarantee pensions equivalent to 80, 90, 100% of the replacement rate. You will be making as much when you're retired as when you were active. Of course, this is interesting for me, but the politician does not say how much this costs. If they would tell us about the cost, I would say, well, I prefer something else. So these are promises. These are promises that are made in our countries, and they could represent doubling of the taxing of the population. And not everyone is willing to pay twice the tax he pays nowadays. So be that as it may, at the level of the expert commissions, we have to work as experts with responsibility and propose things that are logical and viable, feasible, because otherwise this will not work. And I think we are lacking as that kind of reflection in our countries. Logical and feasible reforms. I think that is a lesson that we must learn. Now, in the case of Uruguay, Rodolfo, how has this social and political dialogue been carried out? Well, first, I would like to make a comment on one of the many issues that was touched upon by Diego in his previous remarks. First, the fourth industrial revolution, the second revolution of the machines, as others say. The first was the muscle. Now we're talking about the brain. And I like this idea of the first machine era and the second machine era. And it was said that, of course, there could be a generation that is left behind in this process. And Kayet Benifei, in his book, The Technology Track, that was very famous on the impact of this process, the technological trap. He says that this is basically a new industrial revolution, a fourth industrial revolution. And this should give rise to warning signs, because in my experience, one or two generations suffered a lot in that transformation. So we have a challenge, a permanent challenge. We should not leave anyone behind in this process, which at the end of the day is very positive. Another remark regarding what Diego was telling us, the issue of transparency, I totally agree. In the committee, in the law, we approved the rules of procedure for the commission because we needed rules for our work, and we needed to keep to those rules. For example, the meetings of the committee were not public, and we prepared a summary record of the agreements. This is agreed, this is not agreed, etc. But that summary record was public. That was put on the website. But there was not a parliamentary discourse of the work. There was no parliamentary approach there. And another thing that I find very interesting, because I think it gives us an approach to what are these experiences. Before beginning the work of the committee, I had several meetings with Mario Marcel. He, at that time, was the president of the Central Bank of Chile. I think he now is the Minister of Finance of Chile. And why did I meet with him? I wanted him to tell me about his experience in the leadership of the Reform Committee that he had in 2008. And there we saw that there were other members interested in that dialogue, and there were some tips that he gave us, things that should be done and things that should not be done. And that was very useful for us. It was an experience that we were able to see because the Marcel Committee had a very short working life, 3 months. We were supposed to work for 6 months. And at the end of the day, we worked for a year, because in the middle of this work, we had the pandemics, we had other difficulties, but we saw and learned the experiences in that process from Mr. Marcel. And how did we develop that dialogue? It had 2 stages. First, the work of the committee between November 2020 and 2021. And it had 50 plenary sessions in that period. Sessions where everyone was able to contribute. And at the end of the day, there were some issues were not voted upon, but the diagnostic was made by consensus, even though the report was voted alternatively.
Of course, it would have been great to reach consensus. That's the primary decision-making criteria. And in the absence of consensus, a qualified majority vote. And the 2 reports came out that way, 10 and 15. So CES worked throughout 50 plenary sessions with 75 75 meetings in 8 subgroups to look at the issues. As chair, I was in all groups, and I also chaired the 84 hearings with stakeholders. And with this, we built some experience. Thanks to the Commission's work, we invited a number of entities and organizations that had to be there, trades, union confederations, chambers, and other organizations. And many took the initiative of asking for interviews, which were all granted with no exception. Those we invited, we sent out a prior questionnaire to referring to things that we would like to discuss with them and asking that, if possible, they let us have a memo with their points and the matters of interest to them. Most of them decided to go along, others not, and we weren't strict in demanding that this be done. The exchange was summarized by the Commission's Technical Secretariat, trying to reflect the gist of it all, and then we sent the summary to get feedback from the stakeholders on the summary in order to then have the final report that was published. The documents submitted, obviously subject to consent, were made public. And here you can see a picture of the presentation of one of the fund managers. And here you can see the PIT-CNT, the Trades Union Confederation, the questions, the executive summary. Obviously, this was done subject to prior agreement with each party. And this proved extremely valuable to us as a work methodology. What was the ultimate impact of this in terms of public opinion? To what extent the communication efforts of the Commission had an impact? Here's a sequence of 5 public opinion surveys in different points in time. Actually, 45%. If you look at the period between June and September 2021, you'll see that was the busiest period, and there was an increase in public opinion perception regarding the reform priority. Now we can see in the last period measured that 45% consider this a priority, whereas 41% think it's important but not necessarily a priority. I think the first priority is education reform, and the right, of course. That is the priority in Uruguay as measured. And when we sum up, we find 70% of the population saying that the system should be reformed, which I think is pretty much a result of the work done not only recently, because as I said earlier, even the political leaders of the opposition coalition, when in government, said the same thing. They said there had to be a reform. So now we are these days entering the second stage, the idea being to rise to the challenge in drafting the bill, which is almost wrapped up. The president has made this one of the top priorities, and it is fundamental to have highest level political support. Otherwise, even though you may have a group of 10, 15, or 100 experts saying that this needs to be done, it just won't work. You require political support at the highest level, and we are getting that from the president of the country. What will the success be? We do not yet know. By the end of the year, we'll be able to know what the end of the movie is. Let us hope so. Let's hope it does succeed. very, very interesting to see how the dialogue has taken place in the Commission with all stakeholders. And yesterday, we also talked about the importance of bringing on board all stakeholders, citizens, specialists, all those involved in the process, and the importance of a shared diagnosis was also highlighted, or the technical dialogue you talked about, looking at the legal mandate, the diagnosis, the evidence, and of course, before moving on to the legislative discussion. And in this vein, since you've told us about the group and the sessions and work process, could you tell us about within the sessions and work groups, how that worked? I understand there was first a discussion, right? And alternatives were considered, different financial forecasts and actuarial valuations were taken into account. I understand that all alternatives were considered, options were discussed, viewpoints were exchanged, and then came the decision-making and consensus building process. Can you tell us a bit about the ins and outs? The Commission, as already said, had 15 members and a technical secretariat, which comprised some 20 technical specialists from various organizations involved, university, private organizations, all of the academic sector was involved from across the country. And the way we worked in the groups was generally with a group coordinator who was not necessarily the chair, not necessarily myself, but someone who had particular expertise in the matter at hand. And generally, we had technical inputs prepared by the technical specialists, actuarial projections, or, for example, there was a case in which the IDB was highly involved. This was the option dealing with the design of a voluntary pillar. We also had a consultant that many of you, I'm sure, know, who worked a lot with us. And as part of that group, he had to deal with much of the technical side of things. And regarding the actuarial component, we had a team comprising 4 actuaries that were assigned to the work, and we also had our IT specialists who had to carry out adjustments in the bank simulation model. We also dealt with fiscal commitments, specifically for the military and police forces there. And the work within the groups eventually led to multiple working drafts, which were actually for internal discussion purposes that were not public. In some cases, we discussed with academics, and at some events, we organized with the School of Social Science or the School of Economics. We discussed some of these ideas in order to finally get to the point of coming up with the 2 reports reflecting the work done. One was the diagnosis, and the other one was the report containing recommendations. The diagnostic report is 300 pages long. The recommendations is shorter, some 160 pages. And basically, the diagnostic report is in a diagnostic observations format with some 100 specific concrete recommendations, in addition to 13 annexes, in which we looked at some issues. In fact, I remember a meeting with the IMF specifically. The question is, why is there an annex on youth and education, which we thought was key? Going forward, 30 years, where will we stand in terms of the human skills and capital? What about the resources that are being allocated to the new generations? Also, with regard to the care system, Uruguay is on the way to having a shrinking economically active population. We have two major sectors with growth potential: women, who have lower activity levels compared to men, and they need support for care and professional activity compatibility. So in order to be able to work and harmonize this with the private lives as well. And this is a specific matter when it comes to regulation and supervision. And I go back to what Diego said at the beginning: institutional weaknesses. They're very clear to us in Uruguay. The lack of regulatory agency is very clear, and social security entities are not necessarily applying the best strategies in terms of all the different matters concerned. That in terms of the contents of the diagnostic report. And as for the recommendations, this was divided into a number of components. First, one dealing with the system architecture. We are looking at a system with 4 pillars. I will not dwell on that, as it would be pretty lengthier. Changes in parameters, and one important thing is the proposed automatic parameter indexation considering the higher life expectancy, and this obviously in line with the reforms in several OECD countries. And based on that, we developed the individual components of the system with a view to coming up with the recommendations report, on the basis of which we are now working to turn that into a bill. That is very interesting indeed, the work you did within the commission, as you've described, and especially to see how all of this materialized in the diagnostic and especially recommendations reports. It also very interesting to take a look at that going forward. And now I have a question for Diego in the same vein. Based on your experience in Latin America, what good practices have you identified within the pension councils? For example, Rodolfo was talking about his work, the mandate, whether there's independence or not, where the resources come from, the deliverables, the reports they need to draw up, the members, governors. Have you identified good practices in setting into motion these ad hoc commissions to design, examine, discuss, and propose pension reforms? Does that help validate the reform recommendations? Absolutely, no doubt about that. It is very helpful. And I do believe that the commissions can prove to be an excellent instrument in order for the political powers to then use the experts' recommendations, which does not mean following the experts' recommendations to the letter. After all, they haven't been elected to legislate, but they have been entrusted with recommendations based on their experience and expertise. So I think an intelligent government dealing with pension reforms will set up a good experts commission to make progress on all this, because that's where you deal with the thorny issues and you exchange views. And I will refer to my good friend Erce, who I'm sure will discuss this. The Spanish government has done this at different points in time, has entrusted a commission of experts with something that had to be done, and the government wasn't able to find a way to do that. But based on the experts' opinions, they have been able to say, well, the experts have said this. It's not as easy or as immediate because the governments have to obviously assume their own responsibilities. That's what they get voted for. But I think it is very important to have these commissions, provided they are commissions that do what the one headed by Rodolfo has been doing. That is particularly useful and important. Also, the Marcel Commission, I didn't know about the details, but I think it goes to show the intelligence of Rodolfo and his team in getting together with Mario Marcel first, because when someone has already invented the wheel, you don't need to reinvent it. What we can do is improve it and adapt it to the needs of our carriage. I think that is very useful. What's more, I would tell the next generation of people in government to talk to Mr. Marcel and to these guys. Perhaps they won't do the same thing, but it's good for them to talk to them and hear what they've done. I think pointing the way forward in terms of what the Commission should do is clear. Clear mandate is needed, independence as well, providing resources, and by resources, I mean, obviously, the required funding, but especially data and time in order for them to be able to study things at length and in depth. I think that is vital. And as I said earlier, I've said it earlier, I'll say it now, and I would probably say this again if I get another chance. The leg that I would describe as someone in the office of the president with prestige and responsibility. I won't praise Rodolfo anymore, but well, in the UK, we had a good example of someone who was very prestigious and had great communication skills. So this made it possible to prepare what then followed. And I was reminded of this some time ago. Lord Turner, in a TV interview, they had actually proposed increasing the retirement age. And they said, look, if you're over 50, forget about this. This won't concern you. If you're 40, you'll work one more year. That diffused any opinion against all of this, because it put this into the right scale. You know, this idea of saying, listen, this is nothing. If you're 25 years old and you're told that you'll have to work 3 more years when you've got 40 years ahead, what's the difference? What is there to worry about? So you need to know how to convey the messages appropriately, because you need to win over public opinion in a simple, clear way that is useful for everyone. Yes, certainly, very appropriate points. Actually, it's been very interesting to hear your views, the specifics of the Uruguayan case. That has been very interesting indeed. And this overview shared by Diego regarding several countries in the region. And I would like to now take advantage of this final segment to talk about next steps in the region and perhaps for some final comments. Rodolfo, what is next in the reform process in Uruguay? You see, these days, we are finalizing the preliminary bill. The government has been defining course of action based on recommendations, especially from the Ministries of Economy and Finance and Social Security, as well as the Planning and Budget Office. Actually, on Friday, we will have a key meeting with the actuarial teams who are actually wrapping up the evaluation of the overall result of the evaluation. Someone asked me if we are considering a second best. Of course, we do have a plan B and even a plan C. The government is actually a coalition, and the coalition is defining things. This is a coalition of different political parties. In Uruguay, they are quite stable, but of course they have individual parties with their own interests, and the circumstances related to the pandemic and to some internal political issues mean that we are dealing with this halfway into this administration. The best thing is for these matters to be considered in the first year of a new term, or in the second one at the latest. But now we are already well into the third year, and many political decision makers are keeping an eye on the election in 2024. And it's only natural for this to be the case. So the steps would be to finalize the preliminary bill. There will be a new round of political dialogue before this is sent to Congress. It'll be brief and specific, perhaps for about a month, because things have been very thoroughly discussed. All parties have had their own technical experts involved, so it's not that everyone is starting from a clean slate. And I'm pretty confident that by the end of the year, it'll be clear whether we will have a reform or not. And one could think that if there is no reform, that would be a failure. But I don't think so. I think it's just going to be a deferral. The next administration may, at the beginning, take on the work, give its own touches to it, and advance that way. This wouldn't be the first time this would happen. In fact, in 1995, when we had that reform, a lot of work was done in the previous term. It didn't actually work out, but when the new administration took office, they called the same team that had worked on the 1995 reform. That the previous one had been coordinated by me. The next one was coordinated by a representative of the party that won the election. We were for early notional accounts. They weren't called that way at the time. In fact, the Italians were the first to implement that. But instead of going for plan 2, they said, let's go for plan 3, the mixed or hybrid system. And the attributes of the reform were actually clear. It was easy to have a dialogue and to reach agreement. So I think that even if we don't get the reform through during this term, even though I think there is a considerable chance, I'm pretty confident that the next administration early on will deal with this and carry it through. I think that's what the next steps will be about. I think we're on the eve of embarking on the second phase of political dialogue. Political dialogue and legislative process. Well, all the best with that. Let's hope it works according to plan. And finally, Diego, where does the region stand, and where should we be headed? What should we learn and replicate? What are your recommendations? Would you like to make any final comment before we open up the panel to questions and comments by the audience? By the way, I would like to invite our audience to write their comments in the chat or raise their hand. Yes, regarding the usefulness of what we are discussing this morning and the usefulness of reform commissions, I think that, as I said earlier, I'm all for the existence of such commissions. Needless to say, they need to be geared to the reality of each country, but the success of these commissions, the way I see it, relies on some critical components. First, the independence vis-a-vis the legislative and executive branches, even though the members may have been appointed by them. But the strong political support is needed, as the recommendations will need to then be turned into a law. And this is something that requires work. In some cases, one can include the smartest experts or representatives of different political parties, having them on board in the discussion and analysis process, always based on the assumption that these commissions are technical discussion commissions that will come up with proposals that the elected representatives will then have to decide on and select. Obviously, smaller commissions tend to work better. Otherwise, we become an alternative parliament. So the idea is for them to be small and expeditious commissions. The Swedish Reform Commission reflected more the first point by bringing on board political parties, and the British model was the smaller commission format. They should be able to conduct technical objective analysis, and they should have information available in addition to being able to count on the support of the pension system managers, whether government or private or both. That is needed. Let us not forget, and since I've said private, let's not forget that Social Security is a public matter. It is a matter that has to do with the public interest. The models in several countries in Latin America and in many countries around the world involve the state delegating part of the management of the Social Security system, at least in part, to some entities that are part of this and which are private capital entities. But the ultimate responsibility for Social Security systems should, of course, lie with the states, with governments, of course. And needless to say, the prestige of members is vital, the prestige of the commission members. And as I said, the prestige of the chair as well, since that confers moral authority vis-a-vis parliament, government, and public opinion. But of course, the recommendations will then need to be validated by the legislative branch, and you need to be able to communicate effectively to the population. You need to be able to work calmly. And here comes into the picture something that Rodolfo said, you know, the political schedules, which are not necessarily those that would be advisable for this kind of process. Many friends who have political responsibilities tell you what you don't get done in the first 2 years, you just won't get done at all. So if one of you is going to be elected president of your country, perhaps the third thing you need to do is create the Reform Commission to be able to do this in the early part of your term. Otherwise, you won't be able to do it. Of course, this will vary according to the country and the conditions, and all of this needs to be adapted to the specificities, culture, demographics, and economy of each country. But I think something that is hugely important is something that Rodolfo mentioned, which we often forget. And by this, I mean education. And I don't mean just education at large, but Social Security and pension literacy, which is something we sometimes leave aside, even though this kind of literacy doesn't guarantee that the population will understand what pension systems are. It does help. At the very least, it helps, so to speak, and by the way, I congratulate any Argentine friends, at least it prevents us from having goals scored against us when, you know, there are populist messages that tell beautiful stories, but which are not viable.
Education in the field of Social Security is very important. It's not the solution, but it is a necessary condition so that the population can defend itself against certain premises that can only cause ruin. So these reform commissions should worry about this type of education. This is fundamental. It is a job for the state, of course, but it should be done. And to summarize the worldwide situation, summarizing very broadly what we have now, I think it is very important for society to develop for a society to develop a new way to approach the standard of living. In that regard, states must promote formality in employment, because that is positive for everyone. It is positive for informal workers, and it is also positive for companies that have informal workers. We need to look for new sources of financing. The conclusions report of the committee presided by Rodolfo stated the possibility of basing part of financing financing the system with consumption. We need to be innovative in this regard, and I would like to call upon companies, because we normally say, okay, let the state be in charge. But it's not only what the state can do for us, but what we can do for the state, which is definitely at the end of the day us. So the companies must commit to the financial health of their workers. In this case, the financial health of older workers. It's important to have a greater commitment of companies in all of this. Industry must innovate in investments and things like that. Let me tell you the following. A bad pension design is corrected by good investments. A good pension design can be ruined by bad investments. The investment process in the long term, of course, I'm referring to saving systems. A long-term saving system can be greatly benefited by compound interest. It's something that is very difficult to understand. Not even Einstein understood it. Einstein said that it was one of the great unknowns of the world, compound interest. But this is extremely powerful. When you look at the great US endowments with profitabilities of 12% rate of return, whereas the more aggressive pension funds have 6%, we see that with different new styles of investment, we can obtain uh, much richer pensions, as Nick Byte and Peter Balkman reflect in their books permanently. And a 1% higher profit requires a 20% investment. So a bad design is corrected by good investments. You have to demand industry to be innovative in all this, and the population should be helped to invest, or rather to save, to invest as well, but to save in the long term.